Welcome to Night Lesson. Relax and learn along the way.
Intro. Imagine a mind as vast and unfathomable as the ocean. A mind that was at home not in one, but in a dozen different fields, leaving traces in each of them that extend into our present day. Imagine a man who dreamed of capturing all of human reason in a single universal language, a language in which all disputes, all conflicts, all wars could be settled by a simple command, Calculemus. Let us calculate. In his utopian vision, wars would no longer be fought with cannons, but with ink, and truths would no longer be decided on the battlefield, but on paper. This man saw the world not just in words, but in symbols, in pure, elegant logic. In one of his most visionary moments, long before electricity was tamed, he reduced the entire universe to its most fundamental building blocks. The one and the zero, a state of being and a state of non-being. To his contemporaries, it was a metaphysical game, a philosophical curiosity to be smiled at in the salons. They could not have known that they were looking at the blueprint of the future. For from this simple, binary idea, to be or not to be, on or off, the language of our modern world would emerge. Every email we send, every photo we share, every heartbeat of a computer is an echo of this two-digit symphony. The spirit of a 17th-century genius living on in the silicon veins of our civilization. And yet, when we think of the scientific titans of that era, his name is often the second to be mentioned, if at all. He stands in the immense shadow of another giant, a man whose name sounds like a law of nature. Isaac Newton. This man's story is not just one of unimaginable brilliance, but also of bitter rivalry, of betrayal, and of a legacy so profound that we are only now in the digital age beginning to understand it in its entirety. This is not a simple portrait of a scholar. It is the tragic story of an intellectual gladiatorial combat, a scientific crime case whose verdict would not be delivered for centuries. This is the story of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the last man who knew everything. Chapter 1. The Child Prodigy of Leipzig. Our story begins not in a magnificent palace or a famous observatory, but in the dusty silence of a private library in Leipzig, in the year 1652. The Holy Roman Empire was still licking the wounds of the 30 Years' War, a catastrophe that had devastated entire regions and wiped out a third of the German population. In some areas, the fields had lain fallow for a generation, and the universities, once beacons of knowledge, had withered into shadows of their former selves. It was a time of reconstruction, marked by a deep longing for order and harmony in a world that seemed to have come apart at the seams. In the midst of this atmosphere of destruction and hope, an extraordinary mind was growing. Gottfried Wilhelm was only 6 years old when his father, Friedrich Leibniz, a respected professor of moral philosophy at the University of Leipzig, passed away. The greatest inheritance he left his son was not money or land, but a key to his extensive private library, which contained over 1,000 volumes. For a boy of Gottfried's insatiable curiosity, this was not a room full of books. It was a magical kingdom. The scent of old paper and leather hung in the air. The dim light fell on countless spines, on which the names of thinkers and poets of past centuries were emblazoned in gold. It was a universe of thoughts and stories, waiting to be conquered by a child's mind. While other boys played in the streets of Leipzig, Leibniz lost himself in the writings of the ancients. Normally, such books were kept under lock and key for a boy of his age, as the pagan authors of antiquity were considered unsuitable for young minds. But he begged and pleaded until he was finally allowed to move freely in the library. A friend of the family once found the boy engrossed in a book, and when he saw which one, he could hardly believe his eyes. It was a complex Latin historical work by Livy, filled with rhetorical figures and complex grammar. The young Gottfried, driven by the pictures in the books and an iron will, had taught himself almost single-handedly to read the language of scholars fluently. At the age of 8, he did not just read, he inhaled the texts, debated silently with Cicero and Plato, imagined himself sitting opposite these great minds, arguing with them about the nature of the world. By 12, he had mastered Greek so well that he composed 300 Latin hexameters for a school event in a single morning, to the utter astonishment of his teachers. His mind was not a calm lake, it was a raging river that swept away everything in its path. He did not just devour what was put before him, he actively sought out the deepest and most difficult questions. Even as a teenager, he began to question the rigid scholastic doctrine of his time, which tried to press the world into fixed, unchanging categories derived from the writings of Aristotle and the Church Fathers. Leibniz sensed that these old systems could not capture the dynamics of the world, that there had to be a deeper, hidden order. When he entered the University of Leipzig at just 15, an age when most of his peers were just beginning to struggle with the basics of grammar, he threw himself into philosophy. He read Plato and Aristotle, but also the modern thinkers who were heralding a new era of thought. René Descartes, who claimed the world was a gigantic machine that operated according to mathematical laws. Thomas Hobbes, who dissected the state and human society with cool logic, and Francis Bacon, who preached the experimental method. Leibniz was fascinated by the idea that the world was not just a place of divine mystery, but also a logical system that could be understood and improved through reason and clear principles. But Leibniz was no mere imitator. He developed his own bold vision early on. What, he wondered, if one could combine the best of both worlds, the depth of the ancient philosophers and the clarity of the modern mechanists? What if there was a language, a universal symbolic language, in which all thoughts could be expressed as precisely as mathematical equations, a characteristica universalis, in which misunderstandings would be impossible, because every concept, every relationship would be unambiguously defined? It was a dream that would stay with him for his entire life. His professors were as impressed by his brilliance as they were intimidated. He asked questions that shook the foundations of their established knowledge. He argued with the maturity of a man twice his age, exposing logical contradictions in his master's teachings with polite but relentless precision. He completed his philosophy studies in record time and turned to law, for he saw in law another system that could be ordered according to logical principles. But when the time came for him to receive his doctorate in law, the Leipzig faculty blocked him. The official reason was his age. At 20, he was too young for such an honor. But the real reason was likely envy, mixed with the unease this child prodigy stirred in the older professors. This genius, who had effortlessly outgrown them all, did not fit into their established order. For Leibniz, this was not a defeat, but a liberation. He left his hometown of Leipzig without looking back, and went to the University of Altdorf near Nuremberg. There, his potential was immediately recognized. He was not only offered the doctorate straight away, but also a professorship for life. But Leibniz declined. A quiet chamber in an ivory tower, a life of teaching and repetition, was not for him. He sensed that his destiny was not to preserve old knowledge, but to create new knowledge and to actively change the world. He had bigger plans. He entered the service of the Elector of Mainz, and began a career that would lead him out of the academic world and onto the grand stage of European politics and science. The young man who had read all the books in his father's library now set out to write his own chapters in the history of humanity. Chapter 2. Paris, Huygens, and the Calculating Machine. The world of the late 17th century was a powder keg of political intrigue and scientific revolution, and Leibniz threw himself in head first. In 1672 he traveled to Paris on behalf of the Elector of Mainz, to the undisputed epicenter of culture, power, and science in Europe. Officially he was on a diplomatic mission, but for Leibniz Paris was above all one thing, a paradise of the mind. Paris was an intellectual melting pot. In the salons and coffee houses, in the gardens of the Palais Royal and the halls of the young Académie des Sciences, the intellectual elite of Europe gathered here. Leibniz met the leading thinkers of his time, philosophers and physicists, theologians and mathematicians. The most important encounter, however, was with the Dutch universal scholar Christiaan Huygens, the inventor of the pendulum clock, and one of the most brilliant mathematicians of his generation. Leibniz, who until then had shown primarily as a jurist, philosopher, and logician, openly confessed to the great master that his knowledge of higher mathematics had gaps. Huygens recognized the dormant potential in the young German, and took him under his wing. He gave him a reading list, including the groundbreaking works of Blaise Pascal on probability theory, and René Descartes on analytic geometry. It was more than a reading list, it was a challenge. Huygens gave him a specific, tricky problem about infinite series to solve, which pushed him to his limits. Leibniz struggled, failed at first, spent sleepless nights over papers full of calculations. But his indomitable will drove him on. He worked day and night, and when he finally found the solution, he had not only earned Huygens' respect, but had also ignited a fire within himself. Mathematics, he realized, was not just a tool, it was the key to understanding the universe. Leibniz's mind soaked up the most complex mathematical theories like a dry sponge. Within just 2 years, he was no longer just a student. He was a master on par with the greatest of his time. In this phase of intense learning and research, he turned to a problem that occupied many scholars: the drudgery of calculation. Even simple multiplications and divisions with large numbers were time-consuming and prone to error. Blaise Pascal had already invented a simple adding machine, but Leibniz dreamed of more. He wanted a machine that would not just assist human calculation, but partially replace it. The result was the stepped reckoner. It was a masterpiece of precision engineering, a complex structure of interlocking gears, sliders, and a namesake drum with stepped teeth that enabled different gear ratios depending on the setting. Unlike Pascal's machine, which could only add and subtract, Leibniz's invention could also handle multiplication, division, and could even calculate square roots. When he presented it to the Royal Society in London, the enthusiasm was immense. The scholars present marveled at this mechanical brain. It was a symbol of a new era, in which the limits of the human mind could be expanded by machines. For Leibniz, the stepped reckoner was more than just a practical tool. It was the first tangible step toward his great dream. If numbers and logical operations could be represented in a machine, why not more complex thought processes? He dreamed of a future in which two philosophers arguing over a metaphysical problem would no longer debate endlessly. Instead, they would translate their arguments into his universal symbolic language, enter the symbols into a machine, and say, "Calculemus, let us calculate," and the truth would emerge objectively and indisputably from the calculation. It was a breathtakingly bold dream, centuries ahead of its time. The idea that thinking and calculating could essentially be the same would not be taken up again until the 20th century by pioneers like Alan Turing. But Leibniz laid the groundwork, not only with his machine, but also with his binary system, which he further refined in these years. The representation of all numbers with just 2 digits, 1 and 0. For him, it was a reflection of divine creation, the unity of God and the nothingness from which everything was created. For the world, it would become, centuries later, the basis of a technological revolution. Chapter 3. The Network of Knowledge. Leibniz left Paris in 1676 and took up a position that would define him for the rest of his life. He became librarian and advisor at the court of the Duke of Hanover. It might sound like a step down, from the splendor of Paris to a provincial German city, but Leibniz transformed this position into a command center of European intellectual life. His duties as court librarian were varied. He expanded the ducal library into one of the largest and most important in Europe, with over 200,000 volumes. He worked on a monumental history of the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg, a task that required travels to archives throughout Germany and Italy. He drew up plans for mines in the Harz Mountains, invented a windmill to drain the tunnels, and studied the geology of the region. On the side, he founded the Berlin Academy of Sciences and corresponded with the Russian Tsar Peter the Great about the modernization of his empire. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Leibniz's life in Hanover was his network of letters. In an age without telephones, without the internet, without rapid communication, Leibniz created something that can only be described as an early human network of knowledge. Over the course of his life, he wrote over 15,000 letters to more than 1,100 correspondents throughout Europe and beyond. Kings and emperors, philosophers and theologians, mathematicians and alchemists, Jesuits in China and scholars in Russia, all were in contact with the librarian from Hanover. These letters were not mere pleasantries. They were vessels for ideas, laboratories of thought. Leibniz developed many of his most groundbreaking concepts first in correspondence, in dialogue with other minds. He debated with the English philosopher John Locke on the nature of the human mind. He argued with the theologian Antoine Arnauld about the relationship between body and soul. He exchanged ideas with the mathematician Johann Bernoulli about the latest discoveries in analysis. Each letter was a thread in a vast web that connected the intellectual elite of Europe, and Leibniz sat at the center of this web like a spider, registering every vibration. Today, this collection of letters is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a testament to the importance of this unique network. It was a kind of Internet of the 17th century, except that instead of electrical impulses, parchment and ink traveled across Europe, carried by stagecoaches and messengers, and the server that managed all these connections was the tireless mind of a single man. Chapter 4. The Language of Change. To understand the next decisive phase in Leibniz's intellectual life, we must take a brief look at one of the greatest challenges of the science of his day. Mathematics was brilliant at describing static, unchanging things, the angles of a triangle, the circumference of a circle, the ratios in a geometric figure. But the world is not static. It is in constant motion, in eternal flux. Planets accelerate and slow down on their elliptical orbits around the sun. A cannonball traces a curved path through the air, its velocity changing at every moment due to gravity. A pendulum swings back and forth, and its speed constantly shifts between maximum and zero. The existing mathematics could essentially only take a photograph of the world freezing a single moment. What scientists needed, however, was a film camera. They needed a mathematics of change, a language for the flow of time itself. Leibniz, inspired by his work in Paris and his discussions with Huygens, threw himself at this fundamental problem. He thought not in rigid formulas, but in processes, in infinitely small steps. He imagined a curve not as a finished whole, but as an infinite sequence of tiny straight-line segments, so unimaginably small that they were indistinguishable from the curve itself to the human eye or even the finest instrument. He imagined a surface not as a single unit, but as a sum of infinitely many, wafer-thin strips, like the pages in an infinitely thick book. He called these infinitely small quantities infinitesimals, quantities that were smaller than any imaginable number, yet not zero. From this bold, almost mystical idea, he developed a complete mathematical system, which he called infinitesimal calculus, the calculus of the infinitely small. It was a revolutionary tool of unimagined power. Suddenly one could calculate the instantaneous velocity of an object at any given moment, not just the average velocity over a distance. One could determine the exact slope of a curve at any single point. One could precisely find the area under an arbitrarily complex curved line, something that had only been possible through tedious approximations with previous methods. It was the language that could describe the universe in its flowing dynamism. One could stop time for an infinitely brief moment to observe nature at its work, but the true genius of Leibniz revealed itself not only in the abstract ideas but in the way he represented them, in the notation, in the symbols he invented for his new mathematics. They were so intuitive, so elegant, so perfectly matched to the operations that they made the complexity of the underlying ideas almost disappear. For the process of summing infinitely many small parts, integration, he chose an elongated S inspired by the Latin word summa, sum. The integral sign, integral, was born, and it looks exactly the same today as it did in Leibniz's manuscripts. For calculating the rate of change, differentiation, he used the letter D. For differentia, difference, the famous notation di dx, which generations of pupils and students learned and still learn today, expressed in a brilliantly simple way the relationship between two changing quantities. How much does y change when x changes by a tiny amount? This notation was not just a shortcut or a convenient way of writing. It was a tool for thinking. It guided the hand and the mind of the mathematician. The symbols themselves suggested how to calculate with them. You could move them, cancel them, combine them, almost like algebraic variables, and the results were correct, in contrast to Isaac Newton's dot notation, which was only understandable to the initiated and was limited to specific physical problems. Leibniz's system was universal and designed to be understood and shared. It was so superior that it spread throughout the European continent, and remains over 300 years later the worldwide standard. Every engineer, every physicist, every economist who works with differential equations today uses the language that Leibniz created in the quiet hours of his library in Hanover. In 1684, after years of refinement and exchange with his correspondents, Leibniz took the decisive step. He published his discovery in the academic journal Acta Eruditorum in Leipzig in an article that was only 6 pages long and bore the modest title, A New Method for Maxima and Minima, as well as for tangents, which is not obstructed by fractional or irrational quantities. It was an act of intellectual generosity, a statement of his deep faith in scientific progress through cooperation. He shared his powerful new tool with the world and invited others to use it, criticize it, and develop it further. He did not know that on the other side of the English Channel, in the stone halls of Cambridge, sat another far more suspicious mind, who had reached similar results but jealously guarded them like a treasure in his chest. Isaac Newton had developed his own version of calculus, which he called the calculus of fluxions, back in the 1660s, almost a decade before Leibniz's Paris years. But Newton had published almost none of it. He distrusted the world, feared his ideas could be stolen or torn apart by critics, and preferred to hide his discoveries in encrypted anagrams that only he could decipher. For a while, the two systems coexisted, seemingly peacefully. They acknowledged each other in polite letters, exchanged compliments. But beneath the surface things began to simmer. Friends and supporters of both men, driven by loyalty and perhaps also by the desire to stand in the glow of their masters, began to ask questions. Who had been first? Whose method was the original? And whose was the derivative? Who deserved the immortal fame of the discoverer? The first sparks of an intellectual wildfire began to glow. It would grow into an inferno that would divide the European scientific community for generations and turn Leibniz's final years into a nightmare. Chapter 5. The priority dispute with Newton. What began as an academic debate, a dispute among scholars, over a footnote in history, soon transformed into one of the ugliest and most personal conflicts in the history of science. It was more than just a fight for intellectual supremacy. It became a matter of national honor, a battle between England and the continent, a duel between two completely opposite characters and worldviews. On one side stood Leibniz, the man of the world, the diplomat, the tireless networker and correspondent, who believed in the power of collaboration and open exchange. He had published his work, made it available to the world so that all could build upon it. He saw science as a common endeavor of humanity. On the other side stood Isaac Newton, a figure of almost mythical authority and equally dark complexity. The man who had formulated the laws of gravity, who had broken light into its colors, and explained the motion of the celestial bodies. Newton was an ascetic, a loner, deeply religious and obsessed with alchemical studies, but also secretive, hypersensitive to any criticism, and filled with an almost paranoid suspicion of others. He saw the world of science not as a community project, but as a pantheon whose highest throne he claimed for himself alone. He was, as a historian later put it, a dragon sitting on a hoard of intellectual gold, burning anyone who dared to approach him. The first public accusations came from Newton's followers. In 1699, a mathematician named Nicholas Fatio de Dulier, a close friend and former protege of Newton, insinuated in a publication that Leibniz had stolen Newton's ideas. He implied that Leibniz, during his visit to London in the 1670s, had somehow gained access to Newton's unpublished manuscripts and had copied his own infinitesimal calculus from them. For Leibniz, this was a monstrous affront, a slander against his honor. He had developed his method completely independently, through a different line of thought, and his notation was obviously fundamentally different and far more practical than Newton's cumbersome and private calculus of fluxions. He defended himself publicly, expecting an apology or at least a clarification. But instead, Newton poured oil on the fire from the background. Although he rarely appeared directly, he incited his followers to intensify the attacks, supplied them with ammunition, and apparently enjoyed seeing his rivals suffer. Another of Newton's disciples, the Scottish mathematician John Keill, repeated the plagiarism accusations even more sharply and directly in a journal, accusing Leibniz of merely publishing the calculus of fluxions under another name, and in another notation. The dispute escalated into a war of words, a mud-slinging match fought in pamphlets and journals. Leibniz, feeling unjustly attacked, turned to the Royal Society in London, the most prestigious scientific society in the world, and asked for an impartial investigation to clear his name. It was a fatal mistake, for the president of the Royal Society since 1703 was none other than Isaac Newton himself. Newton appointed an impartial commission to investigate the case. But the impartiality was a farce. He personally selected the members of the commission. They were, without exception, his friends, his students, and his loyal supporters. Leibniz, sitting in distant Hanover, was neither invited to defend himself in person, nor given the opportunity to submit his own evidence. The process took place behind closed doors, and the accused only learned of the verdict after it had already been delivered. It was a show trial in the truest sense of the word. In 1712, the commission published its report, the Commercium Epistolicum Coloni et Aliorum. It was a devastating indictment that found Leibniz guilty of plagiarism. Without any ifs or buts, the report presented it as if Leibniz had orchestrated a kind of conspiracy over decades to rob the great Newton of the glory of his greatest discovery. The evidence was presented selectively. Exculpatory documents were ignored. The conclusions were predetermined. But the worst part was, the report was, as historians later discovered, largely written and edited anonymously by Newton himself. He was prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner in one person. He praised himself in the report as the first discoverer, and condemned Leibniz as a fraud and an intellectual thief, without ever giving him the chance of a fair hearing. The publication of the Commercium Epistolicum was a blow from which Leibniz's reputation in the English-speaking world would not recover for over a century. He was branded a cheat, his life's work dragged through the mud. The dispute poisoned the atmosphere of the entire European scientific community. English mathematicians, out of loyalty to Newton, refused to use Leibniz's superior notation and stubbornly clung to Newton's cumbersome and less elegant method. This intellectual isolation would set British mathematics back for almost a century, while on the continent, where Leibniz's symbols were used, calculus was developed at a breathtaking pace. It was no longer a battle of ideas. It was a national trench war in which science itself became the victim. Leibniz was devastated. The man who had believed his whole life in the exchange of ideas, in reason and in harmony, found himself facing an opponent who fought with entirely different weapons, with slander, with institutional power, with national chauvinism. He spent the last years of his life writing endless letters, memoranda, and justifications to clear his name, to convince the world that he was not a thief. But it was a fight against windmills. He was fighting against the unshakable authority of the great Isaac Newton, the man whom many in England revered not just as a scientist, but almost as a demigod, the universal scholar who had dreamed of ending all the world's disputes with logic and reason, had himself been caught in the whirlpool of an irrational conflict driven by envy, pride, and nationalism, from which there would be no escape for him. Chapter 6, Death in Solitude and the Legacy of the Monads. The scientific dispute was not the only shadow that fell on Leibniz's final years. His political star, which had once shone so brightly, also began to fade. His longtime patron, Elector Georg Ludwig of Hanover, ascended the British throne in 1714 as George I, thus uniting the crowns of England and Hanover. For Leibniz, this could have been the crowning achievement of his career. A direct line to the most powerful monarch in Northern Europe, a place at the court of London, at the center of power. But the opposite happened. In England, Leibniz had become a persona non grata due to the priority dispute. Newton and his allies had done their work at court and in the Royal Society. They whispered to the new king that Leibniz was a fraud, a man without honor. When George I set off for London to take possession of his new kingdom, Leibniz was unequivocally instructed to remain in Hanover and finally complete his long-neglected work as court historian. A monumental history of the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg, which he had been tinkering with for decades without ever finishing. He was sidelined, left behind, cast off. The once celebrated diplomat and advisor, the founder of the Berlin Academy, who had corresponded with czars and emperors, had been demoted to a provincial librarian, forgotten in an empty residence city whose ruler no longer wanted to see him. The last 2 years of his life were marked by illness, bitterness, and increasing isolation. Gout plagued him, and every movement became an agony. His back was bent from the countless hours he had spent hunched over books and manuscripts. Yet even in this dark time, his mind remained restless, incapable of rest. He continued to work on philosophical writings, continued to correspond with the few loyal friends who remained, and refined his ideas. One of these late writings was the Monadology, a short but profound text in which Leibniz summarized his worldview. He imagined reality, not as a collection of dead matter as the mechanists did, but as a universe composed of countless simple, indivisible substances, which he called monads. These monads were not physical atoms, but more like souls or centers of force, each of them unique, each of them reflecting its own perspective on the universe. They had no windows through which anything could enter or leave, and yet they were all connected in a pre-established harmony, a divine plan that ensured everything fit together like the instruments in a cosmic orchestra. It was a vision of breathtaking beauty and complexity, an attempt to find unity in diversity, order in chaos, and it was deeply connected to his lifelong optimism, his conviction that this world, despite all its suffering and imperfection, was the best of all possible worlds, a phrase that would later be bitterly mocked by Voltaire in his novel Candide. But for Leibniz, it was not naive optimism. It was a philosophical argument. A perfect God could only create the best possible world, and the apparent evils were necessary parts of a larger whole that we, with our limited minds, could not fully comprehend. When Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz died in Hanover on November 14, 1716, at the age of 70, the world took little notice. His funeral was a sad testament to his fallen status. No representative of the court was present, no scholar of rank, no emissary from the academies he had co-founded. Only his faithful secretary, Johann Georg Eckhart, followed the coffin to the church. An eyewitness reported that Leibniz was buried more like a robber than like a man who had been the ornament of his country, the man who had known everything, the mind that had held together an entire network of European scholarship, died as if he had never existed. And here our story could end on a tragic note, but that would only be half the truth. Chapter 7. The Immortal Legacy, for history has its own kind of justice, even if it often grinds slowly, much more slowly than a human lifetime. Long after Leibniz's lonely death, when heated tempers had cooled and a new generation of historians and mathematicians looked at the old documents, the truth began to come to light. They examined the manuscripts, compared the dates, reconstructed the chronology, and they found that Newton had indeed developed his method of fluxions earlier, during the years of the Great Plague, when he had retreated to his family's estate. But they also found irrefutable evidence that Leibniz had developed his infinitesimal calculus completely independently, through a different line of thought, inspired by different sources. There was no theft, no plagiarism. It was one of those rare dual discoveries where two geniuses, driven by the same scientific questions of their time, independently arrive at the same fundamental insight. And what was crucial, Leibniz had been the first to publish his discovery, giving the world a system that was far better, more practical, and more universal than that of his rival. The accusation of plagiarism, history finally judged, had been a malicious slander, orchestrated by a brilliant but also deeply resentful and egocentric rival, supported by a corrupt institution. Leibniz was rehabilitated, his name cleared, though far too late to bring him any comfort. But his greatest legacy, the true extent of his genius, was to be revealed only in a distant future, in a way that not even he could have imagined in his wildest dreams. Do you remember his metaphysical game, the binary system, the idea of representing all numbers with only ones and zeros, which he had developed as a young man and continued to explore throughout his life? For Leibniz, this was a reflection of divine creation, the unity of God, the supreme being, represented by the one and nothingness, the void from which God created everything, represented by the zero, From these two simplest elements, he believed, everything else could be derived. For centuries, it remained a footnote in the history of mathematics, an elegant, philosophically interesting, but seemingly useless idea with no practical application. Until the 20th century, when the first pioneers of electrical engineering began to tinker with calculating machines that would no longer work with gears and levers, but with electrical impulses, they faced a fundamental problem. Electricity, they realized, has only two simple, reliable states: current is flowing or current is not flowing. A switch is on or it is off. How could one perform complex calculations with something so primitive, so binary? And suddenly, over 200 years after Leibniz's lonely death in Hanover, his obscure idea was the perfect solution. On became 1, off became 0. The British mathematician George Boole had already created the logical algebra for it in the 19th century, a system for handling logical statements like and, or, and not with mathematical precision. And in the 1930s, the young American engineer Claude Shannon showed in his groundbreaking master's thesis that with this Boolean algebra, based on the binary system, any logical expression, any calculation, could be realized with electrical circuits. Leibniz's metaphysical vision, his dream of a language that could express everything, was transferable to the physical world of wires and transistors. The binary system was the perfect, the only possible language for the digital age that was now dawning. Today, at this very moment, as you hear these words, billions of tiny switches are working in the device you are using, in your phone, your computer, your television. They are turning on and off millions of times per second, 1 and 0, 1 and 0, in a frantic dance of logic and electricity. They are all whispering without knowing it. The language of Leibniz, every click of your mouse, every letter you type, every image you view, every melody you hear, is at its core nothing more than a complex, unimaginably long chain of ones and zeros. A binary symphony, composed according to rules devised by a lonely philosopher in a library over 300 years ago. The dream of the man who died in obscurity became the invisible foundation of our globally connected world. His wish, Calculemus, let us calculate, has come true in a way that his contemporaries would have considered magic. We now calculate constantly, every second, with every search query, every message, every photo. Our machines think for us in the language he invented. The shadow of Isaac Newton is long, his fame undeniable. But the legacy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz is infinite. It is the silent, invisible, binary foundation on which our present is built and on which our future rests. Outro. And so, the circle closes, from the quiet library of an orphan in Leipzig to the global network of light and information that connects us all. The story of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz is more than just the biography of a genius. It is a reminder that the loudest disputes of the present are often overshadowed by the quiet, unstoppable force of a great idea. An idea that, once released into the world, takes on a life of its own, far beyond the worries, the struggles, and even the life of its creator. As the world around you settles into quiet, perhaps you will think for a moment of this tireless spirit, of the man who, despite all hostility and disappointment, never stopped believing in the power of reason, in the possibility of harmony, and in the beauty of order. His life teaches us that true meaning is not always found in fame during one's lifetime, but often in the silent, invisible echo that our thoughts leave in the future. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Dream of great ideas. Sleep well. That was today's night lesson. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Good night and sleep well.